This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Helen Frankenthaler Foundation Executive Director Elizabeth Smith about a new exhibit of Frankenthaler's work currently on display at Gagosian's 24th Street Gallery in New York. Drawing Within Nature, Paintings from the 1990s, features more than a dozen works by Frankenthaler made during a period when she took inspiration from the environment near her Connecticut studio on Long Island Sound. And now, a conversation about the life and work of Helen Frankenthaler with Elizabeth Smith. Elizabeth Smith, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Elizabeth, you're the executive director of the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation. I feel like a lot of the people that follow the art world know who Helen Frankenthaler is, but we can't always assume that everybody does. In those cases where you run into someone who isn't familiar with Helen's work, where do you even start to explain what her work comprised and kind of the context of her as a person in the time period that she was working?
Craig, thank you for having me as a guest on the podcast. I always welcome the opportunity to speak about Helen Frankenthaler's work. And yours is a great question. As you say, many people are familiar with her already, but an equal number are not. So what I usually tell people who don't have familiarity with her work is that she is one of the leading abstract painters of her generation, of the late 20th century, and that her roots are in abstract expressionism, and that we consider her as a second generation abstract expressionist, but as someone whose work continued to develop over decades, and as an artist who continuously tried to experiment and to question what abstract painting was, so that her work remained vital over a period of about 60 years until she died in 2011.
You know, just because someone reaches acclaim in their 30s doesn't mean that they're still going to be respected and valued when they get to their 60s. But Helen, it seemed that she continued to push boundaries and experiment throughout her lifetime, correct?
Yes, I think that's really safe to say. She had an early training in modernism and in abstract painting. And at a very young age, she actually absorbed a lot of the principles of progressive painting of that time. And she, was sort of fierce and fearless in how she wanted to move that forward, in her own practice. So as a very young artist, she began to experiment with a painting technique that became known as the soak stain technique. And then that in turn was influential on a number of other artists. And it was something she deployed in her own work to sort of free it up and move it in a direction that actually had been inspired for her by Jackson Pollock. But she didn't just stop there. And that's the great point that you raise. Really, in each decade of her practice, we can see that she's sort of taking on different challenges and that she's pursuing different through lines of abstract painting. And it's quite invigorating to observe an artist's practice who does that over time while maintaining a kind of, continuity, but yet within those parameters, really creating bodies of work that look quite different one from another. And even in the space of a single decade, her paintings can look very different because she's sort of pursuing different painting problems. I should also say that she has been, or she was in much of her lifetime, associated with the color field painting movement. And I actually think that's not correct. And now we have a better understanding of the fact that Helen really launched her work, and her example helped launch a movement that became known as color field painting, when other artists saw what she had been doing with her experimental soak stain technique. But her work never really adhered to that for very long. She moved in different directions.
Sometimes it seems like artists will have a watershed painting,
When I was talking with Ann Tamkin of MoMA about the Red Studio, we were talking about there was a particular painting that Matisse never finished, he never released, but it was always on the wall of his studio, right? And it was almost like there was something in that painting that kind of unlocked other things for him. And, for Helen, it seems like that painting was Mountains and Sea, and that unlocked this soak-stained period, but that was a genesis. It wasn't the end, right?
Absolutely true. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that remains today still her best known painting. It's the one that's most often reproduced, the one that's most often referred to. But yet you're right. That was just that was an early sort of brilliant explosion of new ideas and fresh thinking that she was investigating. But it was, it remained a touchstone in her later practice as well. But she's done so much more. And that's what I think is really interesting as we look at her whole career, and especially as we consider her the late period of her work that is the least known.
Even in that time, she was inspiring some artists, but some artists like Barnett Newman and, Joan Mitchell maybe kind of commented that those soak-stained paintings, it was too much about the paint taking its own course than the hand of the painter, right? There's always kind of this push and pull between content and craft, right? Like it's almost as if other artists felt like what she was doing was too easy. But that was just in that period, right? Because the more she progressed through her career, the more mark making we see her use, correct?
Well, that's true. But I think that the point that you raise is also really interesting to sort of unpack, because I feel that was a very unfair assessment of Helen Frankenthaler for, yes, and you're correct. Some critics, criticized her work for seemingly like being too easy looking. But I think with Frankenthaler, there's really a strong interplay in her work between spontaneity and control and rigor and analysis. There's a real back and forth as she makes a painting, and that's true for her early work as well as her later work. So that rigor in her practice and her approach doesn't always come across visually. And in fact, she strove to make paintings that, as she put it, appeared to be made all at once or born all at once. For her, anything that looked more labored, that appeared to be more labored, was not something that she really wanted to put out there in the world. So I do think that's a misunderstanding that people at that time had about her work, and the whole debate in abstract expressionism. Do the paintings have to be dark and brooding and existential, or can they have other attributes and characteristics? And Frankenthaler, and also some of her, her younger generation peers, especially some of the women, interestingly, did not work in that, sort of heroic mode of the earlier Abex artists, and they were sometimes criticized. So Helen wasn't the only one, but she did bear her fair share of criticism, which I think was another reason why she continued to drive herself forward in her practice and to pursue different painting problems over time.
You mentioned the other female artists. I mean, she was contemporaries of folks like Grace Hardigan, Joan Mitchell, Lee Krasner. How is it that Helen was the female artist who kind of rose above her contemporaries in acclaim in her lifetime?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think that she had a number of great successes early on that persisted over time. Just, sort of starting at the very beginning, she had a great training in modern painting as a young artist, even in high school. She studied with the Mexican painter Rufino Tamayo when she was a senior in high school, which is kind of incredible to realize he was teaching, high school art in New York City. And then at Bennington College, when she studied with Paul Feely, she was exposed to his ideas about painting and to the study of modernism as well as the old masters. So she absorbed a great deal of art history and theory. And so by the time she graduated from college, she was already really well versed in progressive painting practice. And she studied at Hans Hofmann's painting school, summer painting school in Provincetown, Massachusetts, in 1950, but only for 3 weeks, because she felt she already had, a pretty strong background in modernism and didn't necessarily need to stay longer. So from there, she, early on began to be included in exhibitions, group shows, solo shows. She participated in the 9th Street show. A lot of the other, younger women artists did as well.
Right.
But Frankenthaler, from there, also had her first solo show at Tibor de Nage in the early 50s. She got a lot of attention. She got a lot of acclaim. She, later on in the 50s, she won first prize in painting at the Paris Biennial of 1959. And her work was acquired by some of the major museums. She had her first solo show in 1960 at the Jewish Museum, and on and on. I can list many more achievements, and maybe I'll just list a couple more just to give more of a flavor. But in the 60s, for instance, she represented the U.S. In Venice at the Venice Biennale. She was one of 4 artists in 66 in the U.S. Pavilion, and she had a major touring exhibition organized by the Whitney, a retrospective in 1969 that toured in Europe. So I think those kinds of milestones sort of kept her in the spotlight, put her on the map. She was really recognized in her lifetime as one of the leading artists of her generation, unlike many of the other women. I would say Joan Mitchell is the exception to that. Joan also had a very strong reputation during her lifetime.
The timing of our conversation coincides with an exhibit that is, I believe it, we're talking on March 9th. I believe it opens today at Gagosian, which is related to, the title of the exhibit is Drawing Within Nature, Paintings from the 1990s. My impression from Helen is that she took inspiration from landscapes. If you didn't come to a painting knowing that it was inspired by landscape, there might be some hints there. But landscape's something that she comes back to, right? And she's inspired by her surroundings in particular. Can you kind of talk about that being maybe not necessarily literal depictions, but landscape as a muse for her?
Sure. Landscape and place were very, very important to her as a point of departure, a starting point for thinking about how to translate emotional responses to a landscape or place. And she talked a lot about her interest in the atmosphere of landscape. She didn't want to show us a landscape. She wanted to show us its atmosphere. She wanted to show us the experience of remembering a landscape or a place, being in that environment. And the mountains and sea painting is fascinating in that respect because it responds to a visit she had made to Nova Scotia months earlier with her then partner, the critic Clement Greenberg. And she had been very impressed by the dramatic coastal landscape of Nova Scotia, where the mountains meet the sea. But when she came back to her studio and was making paintings months later, she ended up making a work that she later described as having the landscape in my arm as I did it, which I think is a really sort of curious and interesting way to describe what almost sounds like a kind of muscle memory from a visual or emotional experience of a place.
Right.
She really took her cues from landscapes and, as I said, never depicted something directly or rarely depicted it directly. When she spent summers in Provincetown, Massachusetts, for instance, which she did in the 60s during her marriage to Robert Motherwell, her studio or their home and one of her studios there was right on the Provincetown Bay. So you have, the water right in front of you. And Helen loved to swim. She would swim every day in the bay.
Right.
So some of the works that she created there at that time actually reference the water quite directly. And they're titled after the Provincetown Bay even. But it's almost as if she is... she's giving us like the sensation of the visual experience of the water, or perhaps even of the feeling of swimming, moving through an aqueous, cool environment and translating that into a way of expression that manifests itself in color, form, space, line, all the methods that she used to create like striking abstractions. And in the show of late works that's on view currently, there are also references to landscape that spring to some degree from her residence in Connecticut, where she had a home and also studios adjacent to water. And she was very conscious of the sky too, and the horizon line. When you look out at the ocean or at a body of water, you're always so conscious of that line where the water meets the sky.
Right.
And that, sort of linear horizontality occurs in a lot of her paintings that do reference landscape. I think that's one of the things that is that sort of the connection there. And it's why the show at Gagosian is subtitled Drawing Within Nature, because she was looking for those lines in nature, in the horizon, in the sky, and in the water, as structural ways to approach her painting and infuse it with a suggestion of content rather than the depiction of actual content.
I've heard you speak before about a piece that it's not in the exhibit. It's a piece from 1967 called Flood. And you had quoted Barbara Rose that the piece was not about an image of a sunset or a sunrise, but about the sensation of being inside of that. So it's like drawing inspiration and trying to get to the feeling of it instead of being literal.
Absolutely. I'm very glad you mentioned the painting Flood. It happens to be one of my absolute favorite paintings. I think it's a tour de force of Helen Frankenthaler's achievement throughout her whole career, but certainly, from the late 1960s when she made it. I think that's a prime example of how she would draw inspiration from a landscape, in this case, perhaps a view of the sky, right, or thinking about the sky, observing a sunset or a sunrise. But as Barbara Rose so brilliantly said, it was really about the feeling of being in that space, if one were to be in that space. So you have these lines and flows of reds, oranges, pinks, the brilliant colors that are associated with the sky at those transitional moments. But you also see areas of green and blue and darker hues that might suggest the relationship between sky and landscape, or the sea as it darkens as night falls. So, to me, that's a great example of her idea of an atmosphere of landscape that permeates so much of her work over the years.
Well, preparing for our conversation, I went back and watched an interview that Helen did with Charlie Rose back in 1993, because I felt like, well, here's Helen in her own words in the time of this exhibit. And the thing that really struck me most from that conversation was that she obviously didn't care for art that was literal and political, but it seems like she really professed this love of beauty and the ability of a painting to transcend just being paint on canvas, a sort of alchemy to pursue the sublime, right?
Yes, very much so. She thought a lot about beauty. She talked a lot about beauty at a time when it was not fashionable, if you will, to discuss beauty. If you were an artist, she did so. She was really committed to it. But I think we have to remember that her idea of what beauty is not necessarily just what is visually pleasing, but it's a more complex idea about, as she sometimes put it, what feels right, and how she would struggle and labor in ways that she didn't, want to actually see revealed on the canvas to achieve an image that for her felt right. And sometimes that sense of rightness included awkward passages, clumsiness, the coexistence of dissonant forms or colors. Mm-hmm. And for her, those things felt right. And I think that was, for her, always like a motivating element in making painting, is sort of searching for that in the whole variety of works that she made, where each one, really represents has like a very different demeanor to it. And just thinking about the group of works that's now on view at the gallery, and there are not so many of them, they're all very different. And some are dark and somber, some are airy and buoyant and even sort of playful and whimsical. Some reference, the sea or the land, or even, have sort of cosmic or celestial themes, imagery that's suggestive of those themes, or titles that, sort of pull us in and make us think about what we're looking at in relation to how they're named. So she, her idea about beauty was so sort of wide ranging. And I think it's like really interesting to remember that her attitudes really resonate a lot more now with living painters than they did at the time she was making those paintings in the 90s. Now we have so many interesting artists and younger or middle-aged, mid-career painters thinking about Helen Frankenthaler's work, sharing, the kind of concerns that she was exploring. And I think that is incredibly interesting. that kind of awkwardness, clumsiness, wrestling with what makes a good abstract painting, the coexistence of content and abstract form, rather than, the separation of those things, I think is hugely important for many artists. And I should mention that in a recent book done by my colleague Douglas Dreischboon at the Foundation, which focuses on Helen Frankenthaler's late work, he orchestrated a roundtable discussion with two major living artists, Katerina Grossa and Mary Weatherford. And he brought them together with Pepe Carmel, the art historian, to talk about Helen's painting. And they had a really rich discussion about ways in which Helen's work resonates with their own thinking and practices. And I actually, there's actually a quote from Katerina Grossa that appears in that published transcript that I think is exactly what Helen's work accomplishes. And Katerina says, I'll just read this short quote. Sure. Abstraction is a leap from what we know into a field of unknown possibilities and therefore unnameable qualities. And I think that's a really interesting way to describe abstraction. I think that was exactly what Helen Frankenthaler was after, because even with, her nods to place and landscape, she was always interested in ambiguity. She was always interested in not giving people an easy read of her paintings, but in sort of complicating and amplifying their visual experience with her work. So with that, she seems like a very contemporary painter to me in that regard.
As I hear that quote and I hear you talk about this, it also reminds me of J.M.W. Turner. I mean, same sort of thing. I mean, it was almost like he was calling those paintings landscapes just so that they could be received. But it was really about something else, and it was about opening up the endless possibilities of abstraction.
I agree with you. I think that actually Turner and Frankenthaler have, a number of similarities in that regard. And there was even an exhibition that paired the two of them.
Oh, wow.
Maybe about, not quite 10 years ago, but that was done in the UK, in Margate, which is where Turner had his studio. It was actually like a really interesting and kind of brilliant pairing. And that also reminds me that I should say something about Helen's interest in art history, because I think that's another thing that really differentiates her from a lot of her contemporaries. She had a very active and overt interest in earlier art. She went to museums all the time. She traveled extensively. She sought out the work of older painters, and she made works that overtly referenced those of earlier artists. And that's something that not a lot of abstract expressionists did. So, some of her paintings are direct abstractions of pieces by Manet, for instance, or even, Titian, and other works refer to those artists in terms of their title or some elements in the composition that you can clearly see are drawn from the examples of those earlier artists.
Sure, like Europa was, kind of in response to Rape of Europa, correct?
Absolutely. And there's a passage in the the early painting, the original Europa painting by Titian, that Helen has taken and used as the basis of the abstraction in her own composition. But of course, she changes it immensely. She changes it up in sort of wild ways. But you can see how it was based in that in her view of the earlier work.
She would talk about how some paintings were quick and seemed to paint themselves, while others were struggles where there was working and reworking. This collection of paintings, I think we see some examples of that in this exhibit. Can you talk about some of the paintings and how they kind of bear the scars of a struggle? Some have much thicker textures, scraping, mark making. It's almost like she was in a fight to find that quote unquote beauty, right?
Yes, I think so. And it's interesting to think about her whole body of her later work and just the development of the work over the decades. In the later years, she tended to make works that were, sort of more thickly textured. She became interested in the idea of layering. And, she would work with, sometimes even with principles of chiaroscuro, the traditional techniques of, light and dark, because always creating space, a sensation of spatiality and distance in a painting rather than just a pure flat surface was important for her. So this idea of layering, of putting, another color on top of one beneath it, and then yet another, and then just making all the sort of touches and using various tools and implements also to spread the paint over the surface of a canvas was an important way for her to sort of build up a vital appearing, enlivened surface, which was, really what she wanted to accomplish. Sometimes she did this in a sort of quote unquote easy way, which felt like a real flow was happening. Other times she would have to stop and, really consider what she was doing, rework, and decide when it was done and not overworked. For her, the idea of an overworked painting, something that looked to be really laborious, was a dead painting. And always the sense of aliveness and vitality was what was most important. The issue of struggle in making art is so interesting, and it's something that I think permeates every artist's practice. But she did say at one point that she felt painting was a constant process of renewal and discovery. So she was never content really just to do the thing that seemed easy. She wanted to challenge herself. She wanted to sort of set painting problems for herself and work them out. So in a sense, she embraced that struggle. It was part of what propelled her work forward in ever interesting ways.
Do we know if she ever abandoned paintings, or would she rework it until it became something she was happy with?
Both. Yeah. I mean, sometimes she would just, keep going on something until she felt it was right. And in other times she would, set something aside and not return to it. So there again, really the whole gamut of painting practice is found, or approaches to painting is found in Frankenthaler's work that way.
There are a couple of pieces in the exhibit that feel, I don't want to say familiar, but they carry kind of a sense of Mark Rothko. Am I wrong to see some hints of Rothko in some of these landscapes?
No, I don't think you're wrong to see them, but I don't know really how much they were inspired by Rothko, or how much Helen really, took to heart what he was doing. Of course, she, respected his work greatly. And I mean, your question is a great one, because she did not, I mean, she knew, and she certainly saw and looked at work by everybody.
Right.
She was very well informed about, what was being done, not just by people that she admired, and, felt that she was, in their same lineage, but also what else was happening. When pop art was big, she was, looking at that and sort of taking certain, cues from the more, sort of bright, reductive tendencies that became, hallmarks of that period in her work of the 60s. So, yeah, so she was aware, and she did, she did incorporate what she felt was right for what she wanted to achieve. I would say, I still maintain, I think everybody would maintain that her strongest direct influence was initially was Pollock, but certainly, other artists of the time. I mean, de Kooning, was somebody that she, learned, some lessons from. And she was in dialogue with many of her peers. Grace Hardigan and she were, great friends and had many conversations. But she was actually friendly with and in dialogue with artists that, wouldn't necessarily occur to you, like Tony Caro, the British sculptor, and she were great friends. And, they talked a lot about art. She actually even went to his studio and tried making sculpture at one point and made like a small body of work in sculpture using materials from his studio. And he, in turn, went to her studio and tried his hand at making some paintings. So there were these interesting artistic interchanges she had with people, even including the artist Anne Truitt, and you would never guess there was, a friendship there, but yet there was. But it doesn't necessarily manifest itself in the work.
Well, I think one of the hallmarks of her process was, I guess, what we would call physicality. She, like Pollock, would lay these canvases on the ground and work in a dance, down on the floor. How did that change as she grew older? Because that seems to be a young person's technique. Did she continue that into her 70s, or did the work, come up to a tabletop? Did it wind up going to a wall, for work? How did her process change as she aged?
Well, it's a great question and a great point, and something, again, that many artists deal with if their practice is a very physical one, as Helen Frankenthaler's was. One of the things I think is so interesting is to look at photographs of her or films made of her painting during the 60s and 70s, where you can really see how physical her painting was, not just in terms of her, her arms, her wrists, and her hands, but her whole body. I mean, she is stretching herself around and across and above these very large canvases. So she did that for, a few decades and made the most of it. But as she got older, she did have to make some adjustments because it just wasn't as easy for her to do that anymore. So at one point, she made a quip like, "I don't stoop to conquer anymore," meaning that she stopped, having to lean over to work on the floor. And she did use elevated surfaces for her paintings, tabletops propped up on sawhorses. So she would have the canvases or increasingly very large sheets of paper laid flat on those tabletops. So she could still continue to work on them, on a horizontal plane and to move around the space of the surface, but she didn't have to engage in that like sort of, difficult and demanding physical process in quite the same way.
Can you describe a little bit more the role of the foundation? I guess most foundations kind of function as a steward. What is the charge of your foundation? What is your day-to-day task?
So, yes, we are one of a growing number of artist-endowed foundations in the United States. It's exciting to see how many there are now, and how they're all pursuing similar missions, but in very different ways, according to the identity of the artist that they represent. So our mission as a charitable and philanthropic organization is to steward Helen Frankenthaler's legacy, and also to foster public understanding and appreciation of the visual arts. So that's our mission in a nutshell. I should say that Helen herself established the foundation. She set it up in the 1980s to become active after her death. So when she died in 2011, the terms of her will indicated that her own work, all the work that she had kept, her collection of work by other artists, her archives and papers, her copyright and all of her financial assets would go to the foundation. So we received our bequest from the artist estate in 2013. And from that point on, we became active. So it's now just about 10 years we've been at work. We have a lot of different projects going on because we have such a large and robust and exciting group of works in our holdings. We are able to lend a lot of pieces to museum shows. So at any one time, we have a large number of works out on loan to museums in the US and also internationally. More and more, we're getting international interest in Helen's work. And because we have her archives and papers, we welcome scholars and researchers who are, increasingly interested in studying her work. And we're working on a catalog raisonné project of our own as well, which is, quite a long-term and very demanding project of cataloging all of her known works. We are engaged in quite a bit of philanthropy as well. That's become an increasingly important aspect of what we do. And our initiatives range pretty broadly from an educational mandate. For instance, we have supported Bennington College, Frankenthaler's alma mater, in a museum fellows program that they've been running for quite a few years now. That's been a sort of long-term philanthropic and programmatic engagement for us. And we're now also on the other side of the spectrum in our third year of a program called the Frankenthaler Climate Initiative, where we support museums and art schools that are seeking to reduce their energy consumption and mitigate their climate footprint. So we're pretty broad ranging in the kinds of things we're supporting, but it all stems from this idea of how can we best steward the legacy of Helen Frankenthaler, both in terms of her work and scholarship about her work, and in terms of what we can, sort of give back to the art world and to the visual arts, which is our mission, in Helen Frankenthaler's name. Sure. So it's a pretty exciting mandate, and we're a relatively small staff, but we are pretty busy.
I agree. It seems like it is becoming more common for artists to try to figure out their legacy in their lifetime so that I guess maybe have a sense that people get the legacy correct, right? I can only assume that Helen was passionate about Bennington and the environment and the legacy of her artwork, right?
Well, we know that she was passionate about Bennington. That we have no doubt. I mean, she, constantly spoke about how important it was for her. She served on their board of trustees. She had exhibitions there over time, and she was always very engaged with Bennington. So that was an absolute no-brainer for us. But in terms of the climate program, that was something that really came about through the forward-looking thinking of our trustees. And I would say that in our case, Helen was not really prescriptive about what she wanted the foundation to do, other than, to steward her legacy and foster understanding and appreciation of visual arts. She left it to the trustees of the foundation, who she knew very well. I mean, she selected the individuals that she wanted to steward that legacy. And then they in turn, hired me and we built a staff to pursue the mission. So she wanted, I guess, I feel she did, the absolute best thing, which was to leave it in good hands with people whom she trusted to make the right decisions, in her name, and to do things that she might not have even thought about. The environment, wasn't necessarily a big concern or issue for her. I think at that time, not too many people were, it wasn't the same kind of issue then as it is now. But we do know that, she talked about in her own work, abstract climates, and the importance of landscape and place. So we can sort of kind of extrapolate that to our current climate initiative, but really it's more about thinking what we can do to help meet current needs in the art world that are also more broadly social. Sure. We're very interested in doing that. And a lot of other foundations are doing, similar work. So it's a very satisfying thing to be doing. And we feel we're doing right by Helen Frankenthaler's name and legacy in this way.
Well, Elizabeth, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk about Helen and her legacy. And this exhibit that's up now through April 15th at Gagosian's West 24th Gallery, Drawing Within Nature, Paintings from the 1990s. Thank you so much for spending the hour with me.
It was a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for inviting me.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.